We're live. So my name is Will Sarney. I'm the CEO of Water Foundry and general partner of Water Foundry Ventures. We are co-convening this session with SIWI. A little bit of a backstory here. Stefan and Jenny contacted me months ago and asked if I wanted to participate in co-convening this session on governance and innovation. So, of course, the only word I really heard was innovation. And once it hit me that it was, governance, I stuck with it and said, all right, well, let's be creative and let's think about this a little bit differently. And I'm glad that I'm here and participating in the session and bringing in really interesting speakers, a different way of thinking about things. Some of them are from outside the water sector, which I firmly believe is critical if we're really going to make progress at a faster pace. That's not to say that we're not doing that on our own, but mixing it up a little bit is critical. In addition to being innovative on the topic and the speakers, the format's going to be a little bit innovative, thanks to my friend Tom Higley, in structuring this a little bit, more in a way that's engaging, I would say. A few key points that I just want to lay out. This is a hybrid session. Part will be online. Let's see. This is the first of 3 sessions in the governance seminar series. The other sessions include a 90-minute hybrid in-person online session tomorrow at 11. Let's see, and a 60-minute online session on Tuesday at 7. So that's it. I hope you have a lot of questions, and I'm going to just talk a little bit about the journey to catalytic communities and what that all means. So I've been doing corporate water strategy for about 20 years. Collective action became a term of art as companies started to move beyond water management and really thinking about value at risk across their entire supply chain, value chain. Collective action has done pretty well, but not as great as I think we all had hoped. I met Anna Muyo when I was at Deloitte, and she started talking about aligned action and got me thinking about, well, what could we do that improves on collective action? And became a big fan of aligned action and that thinking. Along the way, I met Tom Higley, who introduced me to the notion, the construct of wicked problems. So if any of you follow me, you know that I rant and rave about wicked problems, super wicked problems. And then lo and behold, Tom introduced me to catalytic communities. So these, in my mind, are not discrete ideas and initiatives, but they all link together. And I view them as essentially a maturity journey, if you will, in terms of how do we think about us doing better with respect to solving wicked water problems. And unfortunately, there's no shortage of those. So I encourage you to open up your mind, think differently about why we're here, what we're trying to accomplish. I think it's all too clear that the challenges that we face with respect to water and the intersection of climate change and ag and food are incredibly daunting. But I'm an optimist, so I think after 90 minutes we'll have some great ideas that we'll take home and get stuff done. So let's see, the panelists, they're not really panelists, we're going to have conversations. So Tom Higley, he is the founder and CEO of Genesis and now Systemic Studio and Fund. Tom's going to talk about that a little bit. Carolina Garcia, Global Sustainability Innovation Director at AB InBev, and co-leads the 100 Plus Accelerator program. Anna Muyo is joining us online. She is the founder of the Theory of We and the instigator that got me thinking about aligned action. Austin Alexander, VP of Sustainability and Social Impact at Xylem. So very diverse perspectives and initiatives that they're engaged in so we can solve water problems. So with that, I want to have each one of them come up and we're going to have a one-on-one conversation. Then we'll all come up here and have a panel discussion. I hate the word panel, but we're going to talk as a group and be as engaging as possible. I hope you have a lot of questions and challenge some of the notions that we hold dearly, I would guess. So with that, Tom. So I guess you all know that Tom and I go way back. He's shaped my thinking with respect to water, wicked problems, catalytic communities. So Tom, what do you do? Like, why did you pick these topics?
I think there's probably some fundamental flaw in my character. That's probably the answer. The truth is that after spending several decades as an entrepreneur, I grew fundamentally dissatisfied with what I was seeing in terms of the allocation of time, energy, talent from entrepreneurs, and capital from investors. It seemed as though far too much of all of those resources was going to things that mattered very little in the world. And that sort of breakdown of an alignment between value creation on the one hand, and the resources to generate that value in the world, that misalignment just seemed like it needed attention. And probably in around 2012 or so, I began to think more about the notion of wicked problems. That's what took me on this journey. And I think we've talked a lot about what those are. But maybe for people who haven't heard about wicked problems and what those are, we should say something about that.
I think you should.
So let me just suggest that the best resource on this is an old one. It's about 50 years old. It's called Dilemmas in a General Theory of Planning, a wonderful paper by Horst Rittel and Melvin Weber, 1973. But here's what it says in essence. It says that you can separate the kinds of problems that we're forced to deal with into two broad categories: tame problems and wicked problems. Tame problems are readily solved with mathematics, science, engineering. We know the answers. And what's wonderful about them is you can be relatively objective about the inputs, so what it will take to solve the problem, and the outputs. You'll understand objectively whether you've achieved what it is you set out to do. Those are wonderful problems. Wouldn't it be wonderful if all of the problems that we face in the world could be addressed in that way? But they can't. So wicked problems are wicked because in effect they require us to understand the subjectivity that relates both to the inputs and outputs. So there's not a definitive formulation or framing of a wicked problem. On the contrary, there are lots of ways to think about the wicked problem and therefore huge challenges. And then it's also true that the outputs, what you do to address a wicked problem, that also is not objective. There are different perspectives about what should be done and how that ought to be done. So that was the fundamental notion.
Yeah, and Tom, I don't know if you recall, but when we first met, you ran through the definition of a wicked problem. I read the original paper, and one thing that connected this idea of a wicked problem to my world, which was embracing collective action, was that no one stakeholder can solve wicked problems. And we could talk about solving and taming and so on, but that is absolutely relevant in the world of water, where if you look at corporate water strategy, collective action, as a term of art, is usually a key component of that. So for me, connecting that attribute, in addition to some of the other things you mentioned, to the world of water was really the glue in all of it. And I don't know if you've seen super wicked problems now. There's a little bit of research being done on that, and it's really interesting. They've used climate as an example of super wicked problems, and they also talk about how super wicked problems are trying to be solved by those entities that actually cause them, and they're not really the ideal stakeholder to be involved in solving wicked problems, super wicked problems, or even taming. And I want to talk to you about whether, the best we can hope for is just to tame it.
I hope what happens in the conversation that develops here today as we begin to unpack these things is that there'll be multiple perspectives about this. I think we mentioned earlier in a conversation, back in 2009, Elinor Ostrom, who then won the Nobel, was here in Stockholm and talked about the radical change that she was representing in terms of collective action. And one of the really important things that came from her research that addressed the tragedy of the commons paper that Garrett Hardin had written. His paper was about the tragedy of the commons and the problematic nature of collective action. And she said quite plainly, it really isn't just the market, it isn't really just government. You can look at the real world and see how people have figured out how to do what needs to be done in relation to these, she didn't use the term, but wicked problems, and how they manage those resources. And that was the beginning of a new way of thinking about collective action, then.
Very relevant today. So Tom, I'm going to bring in Anna, and we'll continue the conversation, then bring everybody back up. So thanks.
Wonderful.
All right. Thank you, Tom. Anna, is she on? We're going to have her.
I can hear you.
Anna, you can hear us. There you go. Good to see you. Wish you were here. I hate using the word old, but my longtime friend from my Deloitte days, Anna, who shaped my thinking about collective action, aligned action. Thank you, Jenny. Can you just give us a little bit of an intro in terms of what you're doing right now and how your thinking has evolved over time about aligned action, wicked problems, and what you see as some of the solutions? And I want to dive into a few questions over the next 4.5 minutes or so and keep the conversation going.
Sure. Will, thank you for inviting me into this conversation and to be here with Tom, Carolina, and Austin. I'm always up for a discussion about how to tackle wicked problems, and caught a little bit of Tom's framing around the difference between wicked problems and tame problems. So eager to get into that. I wanted to start, though, just by sharing the other week I was reading the paper and came across an article about Uruguay's water crisis. And I'm sure many of you in the world of water, this is your world, less my world, are deeply familiar with what's happening in Uruguay, where more than half of the 3.5 million citizens are without access to drinkable tap water. And experts in the country say that this situation could continue for months. And I know this situation, this kind of headline, this kind of story is becoming more the norm than the exception in the world, unfortunately, and it's easy to become inoculated to these kinds of crises. One of the things that I have stuck on from that article is that the former president of Uruguay apologized to the Uruguayan people and shared in the blame. And in doing so, he said, and this is a quote that I have here, he said, "People will be mad at me, but we all fell asleep." We all fell asleep. Will, I am haunted by those 4 words, and it's fair to say that we have all fallen asleep at the global wheel when it comes to managing the common resources we all depend on, whether those be water, forests, air, oceans, or just the fundamental resources required in a functioning global economy. democracy, equality, civility, security. And I think the degree to which you accept the notion that we've all fallen asleep may determine the degree of the concern, the urgency, or even the heartache you may feel right now in this room you all are in, and certainly the virtual room we're in today. And so I'm showing up to this conversation with heartache for the ecological crisis we're all living through, and also with a really strong conviction to wake up, not to continue to be asleep, and not in the woke way that term has become super politicized and weaponized in my country, but to wake up and engage in problem solving in radically different ways than the status quo. So as you referenced, we met over a decade ago at Deloitte, where I spent many years working at the Monitor Institute within Deloitte, working on how to tackle wicked problems through a problem-solving approach known as aligned action, which is the practice area I developed and led within Deloitte. And as Tom started to hint to, aligned action asks one simple and critical question, which is how can we create networks of diverse leaders, diverse organizations from across sectors that can achieve greater levels of alignment, coordination, shared will, and shared intent to tackle wicked problems. And aligned action focuses relentlessly on the process of how to do that, the process of how to mobilize leaders from organizations throughout a problem ecosystem behind a shared vision for change that they know none of them can do on their own. And how do we align these networks for impact behind an infinitely more coherent, coordinated, and strategic plan for action in order to tackle wicked problems? And in this article, it was interesting because I think it was the former National Director of Energy in Norway, and this time around, managing the commons, he said, quote, "We were too late to have a vision of strategic planning about water." So we're both asleep and we're too late. And aligned action is about supporting the development of that collective strategic plan to address wicked problems.
Thanks, Anna. Something real quick before I bring up Carolina. You know, one thing that struck me when you and I first met at Deloitte was the difference between my world talking about collective action, which really applauded just bringing people together, and your construct around aligned action, which was really a lot of greater structure, greater commitment, and focusing on the process. So again, not bashing collective action, but the rigor that you brought to the table with aligned action and how that really sort of changed our thinking around, you know, basically accepting that, yeah, we're bringing diverse people into a room, but things fall to the lowest common denominator. So when we have a group conversation, let's touch on that a little bit. The structure and the process, I think, is really impactful. So Anna, thanks. I'll call you back shortly. Carolina, you want to come up?
Can you hear me? Great.
Yes. So Carolina, thanks for being here. Really fascinated by what you have done, what your company has done around the 100 Plus Accelerator program. And then I want to talk to you about Charco Bandito, an actual example of, I think, really more than collective action. And you were there at the beginning of that project. And let's get into the weeds in terms of what you saw at the beginning and where we're at right now and where you think that is going to go. But I view the 100 Plus Accelerator program as building a catalytic community. And for me, when you started just as an individual company, it satisfied that, check the box that, yeah, this is a catalytic community. The fact that you brought in other multinationals and you're all playing nice together, I think, is really, really unique. So can you talk a little bit about both?
Of course, Will, and hello everyone. And for those that don't know the 100 Plus Accelerator, perhaps it's good to remind you that the 100 Plus Accelerator is an open innovation initiative that AB InBev launched in 2018 when we launched our global sustainability goals as a strategy to reach the goals faster through innovation, partnering with startups all across the world that were trying to actually solve those wicked problems. And we did it successfully, but then realized that, of course, if we joined with other members of the industry, we would be even more successful because the problems that AB InBev is facing aren't problems exclusive of AB InBev, are problems that the whole industry is facing, and that if we collaborated, we could go faster and we could scale. However, that's easier said than done, of course, and we were just mentioning that when we managed to build this partnership with Unilever, Coca-Cola, and Colgate-Palmolive, it was in the middle of the pandemic. And I think perhaps that created the good atmosphere to collaborate as well. But of course, it was on an uncertain time, and 4 of the largest companies in the world decided to join, leave aside their competition to boost innovation through collaboration, which for me is very inspiring because we have 4 of the largest companies whose products probably you have in your households working together in almost every market with innovators all across the world and learning from each other to scale these solutions.
And what was it like to bring in other multinationals into this journey? Did you reach out to them? Did they come to you? I mean, how did you bring in others?
It was both. At the very beginning, when the company launched the 100 Plus Accelerator, they always had the vision of bringing others. However, at the beginning, it was too soon. Sometimes bringing others when you don't have results, it's harder, right? So I think since the very beginning of the 100 Plus Accelerator, that was the dream. However, that came organically when we actually managed to showcase results. The first company to reach out was, in fact, Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola saw one of our webinars when we were showing some of the results of the pilot. They got interest, and of course, sometimes you just need a courageous leader in an institution to talk with another and start building some magic. And then after that, we were also speaking with Colgate. Colgate joined, then our leadership made some calls for Unilever, and everything came out together very fast. But what was fascinating to me is that one of the key aspects for collective action is trust. It's very hard to move fast when you don't trust the people that you're working with. And of course, to build trust requires time, also getting to know the people. It's important as humans, right? And we are in the middle of the pandemic. We had to meet each other via Zoom. And I think one of the most beautiful things that we did to build that trust was to create a series of workshops with the corporate partners to help us envision the governance rules and the basic principles of that partnership, making sure that we were all aligned in that bigger picture. And then when that happened, of course, we brought in the lawyers to build the framework and the legal agreement that needs to be set in place to build a partnership like this. But I think it was very inspiring to see these 4 companies coming together and building trust in a moment where we couldn't even meet in person. And now we've been together for the last 3 years. We just launched applications for cohort 5, and the 4 companies have been together since cohort 3. And I do think that this partnership will go for the long run.
I think it's great that you brought up the issue of trust. I was speaking to a CEO of a water technology startup, and I asked him about his sales cycle, and he said it's the speed of trust. And I think we tend to forget about that human need in all of this in terms of scaling and impact and accelerating solutions. Can you give us a little bit of the backstory on Charco Bendito and where it's at right now in the next minute or so, and then we'll come back to it?
Perfect. I think Charco Bendito, similar story, but different timing. As you will know, and there's actually a session on Charco Bendito in the program, so don't miss it. But Beer, the Beverage Industry Environmental Roundtable, had joined forces and decided that they wanted collective action in a specific watershed. And on a global level, they had decided that Mexico and Guadalajara could be a good fit. So after that had been decided on a global level, at that time I was working at a regional level in Latin America for AB InBev. So the regional leaders, we met at Guadalajara, we saw different strategies for the watershed protection, and we decided to go on a road. And then 2 weeks later, COVID began. So all the enthusiasm, all the commitments that came through COVID, at some point became an uncertainty, right? During COVID, many budgets were frozen. People didn't know if they could deliver on the projects that were planned because other things were prioritized. And what I think, going back to trust, what I think is very special about Charco Bendito is that we kind of said, okay, the perfect is the enemy of the good. Let's stick together, which I also think it's very important for speed and wicked problems. Let's work together. It doesn't matter that all the 5 companies that were originally in the partnership have to put the same amount of budget, the same amount of energy. Let's all put whatever we can. That's great, but we will go together as equals, which is also very hard sometimes in partnerships where you expect everyone to collaborate in the same way and you're very strict about that. In this case, we were compassionate, everyone can do a fair amount, let's all go together as equals. And I think that that's what saved the project in a very difficult time. And right now the project has grown. I'm super proud to see it. And we now have 10 companies. I just received the news that Nestle joined, and it also went beyond beverage, right? Now we have food companies like Nestle, Bimbo, or Mars. So that for me, it's also very inspiring.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right, now Austin Alexander from Xylem is going to join us online. Austin, you there? Hey, Austin.
Hey.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. Good morning.
Yes, good afternoon. Austin, thanks for participating. I think it's pretty obvious why I invited you, and hopefully you said yes, in terms of bringing your perspective as a large, significant water technology solution provider, but it really goes beyond that in terms of, and this goes back to your session at UN Water Week, really leveraging who you are, your reach, which has now been expanded through the acquisition of Evoqua, and bringing people together to scale investments in the water sector. And I think there's pretty widespread recognition that not enough money is going into investing in innovative water technology companies to solve access to water, water scarcity, and poor water quality. So can you just tell everyone a little bit about, one, what you do at Xylem and your focus, and what you launched at UN Water Week, and then where does it stand right now in terms of feedback? I'd say it was met enthusiastically and had a pretty significant dollar value assigned to impact.
Yeah, great, absolutely. So I lead sustainability and social impact for Xylem. So that's responsible for our own sustainability programs and social impact programs, but also I focus a lot of time on where Xylem in the water sector can intersect on issues of decarbonization, water stewardship, and water security. As you mentioned, in mid-March, we were approaching UN Water Week, probably like many organizations in the room of where do we fit in? We want to be present there, and we know we have a role as a large technology provider for the sector. But where is really the gap that we think we can uniquely fit into? And as we looked at all of these large commitments and needs in water being surfaced leading up to and during UN Water Week, we said, hey, maybe this is the opportunity for us to show, to get to the solution on these problems, we need the technology to get there. And Xylem alone can't do it. And so we rounded a number of very trusted partners, to put what Carolina said, hey, we want to put together this half-baked idea. What do you think? And we got a number of companies that came together and said, yes, we're willing to put together our investment in innovation for water technology over the next 5 years. And that number rolled up to over $11 billion of collective investment in new innovative water technologies over the next 5 years. And that's not nothing. But what it catalyzed is, okay, how do we start working together as the private sector to make sure we're moving technology into this space faster and to solve these problems. So following that event, it was standing room only. You were in the room well. It was a bit impressive to be a part of. And we are now looking to get back together with our partners in March of 2024 to keep the conversation going. And a number of our partners have had a lot of one-on-one conversations of what they're doing and how we can start supporting each other.
So, yeah, Austin, it was incredibly well attended. I think we vastly exceeded the safe number of people in that conference room, probably by 100%. I mean, it really struck me how excited people were to be part of it and commit to, you know, a dollar investment over the next 5 years. And then also the second piece, which I think goes back to, you know, part of the definition of, you know, who's wicked problems and who solves wicked problems, is that it was a pretty diverse crowd. I mean, it was just not just the private sector. You know, the public sector was there, NGOs were there, water technology accelerators, you know, Imagine H2O was there. So very diverse, really interesting and different perspectives, really all coming together to make a commitment to invest money in water technologies and projects. And what do you expect to see next year when you get the gang back together?
Yeah, I think, well, you kind of hit on it, Will. I was a bit shocked. I probably should have been when you put 11 billion out there. You do get a lot of attention from different organizations. But we received a lot of feedback from those outside the private sector, like the non-profit groups, government policymakers. It says, hey, what can we do to support this? Because we think you have found a gap here, and we want to help. And so I expect us broadening not only the number of private sector players that are coming in and saying, hey, we're ready to be a part of this, but also bringing in those players outside, which is exactly what a catalytic community is supposed to do, bring in those that we're not working with day to day, from nonprofit to government to others. And so I'm hopeful that we're able to attract some more folks from other areas.
Everyone will be watching you closely next year, Austin. So, Austin, thanks. Can both of you come on stage, and we'll have Anna and Austin stay online, and we'll have a conversation for 30-ish minutes, is that right? And then open it up to Q&A. So come on up. So the goal here is not for me to lob softball questions to the four of them. It's to get all of us engaged in a conversation about some of the topics that we touched on briefly. And then, of course, get you engaged in the conversation. So a couple of things. It struck me that, nice job on defining wicked problems, but can you spend a minute defining catalytic communities and adding a little bit of rigor to that? Because I'm willing to bet that there are people listening that really don't know what we're talking about. And, you know, I don't either, Tom, so go for it.
Yeah. So thank you, Will. And thank you, all of you, for being here to listen to this and maybe roll up your sleeves and participate in this in a bit. So let's go through the three things that are characteristic of catalytic community. To begin with, we're talking about a diverse cross-sector collection of participants who are connected and communicating around a shared purpose. So this goes to something I heard earlier. It's not just enough to pull people together. People have to see themselves as part of a group that are working together around a shared purpose. The second part of the definition relates really specifically to collaboration and learning in relation to that shared purpose in order to achieve the third thing that's part of the definition, which is really the creation of something new. Something that hasn't existed previous to this catalytic community and its work. And that something new could be a project, it could be a venture, it could be a movement, it could be an organization, an institution, and I've heard examples of catalytic community being reflected in what Austin shared, what Hannah shared, what Carolina shared. I think this is really an expression of what Eleanor Ostrom was imagining was possible through collective action, and I think catalytic community is really about expediting that, doing that in powerful ways, in ways that we've maybe not seen until now.
Great, thanks. Okay, so my second sort of question to get the conversation going is, this doesn't really sound that new. You know, being just a little skeptical here, in that, aren't we really talking about collective action? And I just want us to get to talk about that a little bit in terms of how you see catalytic communities different than what has become a key part of corporate water strategy, collective action. I mean, I have an opinion on this, but I'm interested in the rest of you, and maybe start, well, Carolina, what do you think? What's the difference besides the definition? Or, you know, even the definition sounds a little similar.
Well, my personal opinion is that sometimes we give also fancy names to similar things, to be honest. And
I think the discussion's over
but,
there, Carolina.
but
You know.
yeah, so that on the one hand, but I think that doesn't really matter as long as we are actually involving the different stakeholders, going all together with a shared vision and actually delivering on what Tom just said. Of course, collective action sometimes is top-down, for example, and everyone needs to head towards the same goal, whereas in a catalytic community, it shouldn't be top-down, right? Because everyone needs to be inputting to the solution. Everyone needs to add value to the solution. And it also requires that diversity and plurality of stakeholders. And how to do it? I think governance, which is the big other part of this seminar, is very important. And there's not a recipe, right? Like, we need to understand each time where we're joining different types of partnerships or catalytic communities, or when we are in a platform for collective action, how to build a governance structure where everyone can participate and that people are collectively engaging in the building of that governance. And I think it's through that, like, overarching mechanism that you can actually have the catalytic community that we've just described.
So what I'm hearing is a bias for action is, you know, a key part of creating a catalytic community, not just signing up and showing up in a room and writing a check and hoping for the best. Mm-hmm. Okay. Austin, Anna, what do you think?
I'm happy to jump in. Will, Anna, I'm happy to jump in and just kind of take the lead of what I've heard Carolina and Tom describe, and certainly in the example that Austin shared. I mean, if we think about just the actual characteristics of a wicked problem, we know that these problems are elusive and emergent and shifting, right? And by that, there's a lot of like big terms, but there's so many diverse and dynamic interconnections between the problem and the broader environment, which itself is unstable and dynamic. So while whatever term we use, aligned action, collective impact, catalytic communities, I think that the underlying imperative is to create support over time. We haven't really talked about the element of time in this conversation, where this isn't about launching a single point solution over a year or two, but more how can we create the conditions for the ecosystem of actors throughout the problem ecosystem to be integrated and connected over time so that we create an equally adaptive, emergent, problem-solving human system. And so that takes care and feeding. We often call them ecosystem integrators or network leaders, but it's a very specific role and function in supporting these kinds of catalytic communities. And I think that we also know that wicked problems absolutely defy single point solutions. Single point interventions, no matter how big, bold, well-resourced they are. And they actually require what we think of as a portfolio of interventions. So it's only through these kind of collective efforts that we can both design and implement portfolios of interventions that operate throughout the problem ecosystem. And what I mean by that is they tackle different barriers. They're designed to influence different stakeholders. They operate on different time scales with different levels of ambition. And so in the world I'm working in now around reimagining capitalism in the US, launched a network of leaders throughout the US. We're at the state of having developed a shared vision for how to shift our capital markets and then really move to designing an elegant set of interventions that we know will fail some of them will succeed, but will stay in this collective so we can be a learning, adaptive human ecosystem as we learn and adapt to the problem system, right? Because there's no solution to a wicked problem. I think, Tom, I heard you reference that, and we can get into that, right? It's just how we can continue to adapt over time. And so how do we support the humans and the organizations and the diverse stakeholders in doing that is critical in all of this work.
So you brought up a couple things, and I want to come back to the speed question. And also the issue of, are we really trying to solve these problems? Can we solve these problems, or can we just tame them to a point where they're infinitely more manageable and the solutions are equitable? And I want to come back to the topic of catalytic communities and examples that are not obvious. But Austin, can you weigh in on this in terms of, okay, we really just talking about collective action, or based on your experience, is this an evolution in thinking that drives us to faster solutions?
Yeah, thanks, Will. Like many plus signs to everything Anna just said, I really like thinking about the portfolio approach as well. I think to me there's two pieces that have to be apart to move it from to really make something catalytic, if that's the right word, or to a catalytic community. But the first that you mentioned, bias for action. The worst thing we can do is put out what we were able to do is pull some partners together to do Water Week, have a very cool event and a press release, and if we leave it at that, then that will be for nothing. And so we're actively moving on that to say we want this to be something, and we have a tendency to make big commitments, and I'm saying we as the broader business world, and make sure that we put some substance in it. So bias for action. And the second, which Anna hinted at and that I love, is it has to be a community outside of our normal players as well. It has to really be inclusive of those that are not typically part of the conversation. And so I think that's a key piece, especially as we move through events like Stockholm Water Week or UN Water Week. where it does end up being a lot of the same people, which is wonderful. But if we don't do these events and go out into the communities and bring in other organizations and players that are not typically part of these conversations, that's also not, we cannot, the problems are so great, we as even just water sector cannot solve it alone.
So are you really advocating we get out of the echo chamber, Austin? Really?
I am!
I love how that Austin.
What's that, Anna?
I just want to plus one everything that Austin just said. I think that's absolutely critical if we want to establish really comprehensive view on what the problem is, and therefore what the solutions need to be, actively and intentionally engaging people outside the echo chamber. It will add time to the process in finding not the lowest common denominator, but actually finding that how to ladder up to a bigger theory of change and the change that's needed. It will be strengthened by bringing in people who you may radically disagree with. And you may have competing theories of change or competing theories of the case, but ultimately, if you can stitch those together in really kind of elegant and comprehensive vision, shared vision for change, once you can do that, the action, and I want to, the bias for action that I heard Austin talk about is, I work in the world of aligned action. It's not aligned learning, it's aligned action, because it does have a bias for action. But there often, it takes time to be able to get to that point where you can collectively act. And sometimes we shortchange that time. It's the trust that Carolina talked about, right? Change needs at the speed of trust, and that's often slow. That takes time. And if we don't recognize that, I think we can move to action that need the action, but is it the right action? Or is it a sustainable action? Will it sustain past the headlines of the big splashy commitments? That's also a question we need to ask.
I think that question is being asked by many people now in the world of water, where there's no shortage of pledges and commitments. And, you know, my personal view is it's driven to a large degree by ESG, the ESG rage. So, you know, how do we rethink investment in initiatives, actions, and so on, and hold ourselves accountable for performance? And we touched on governance a little bit, but it seems that that's such a key part of all of this, you know, roles, responsibilities, you know, how do you sustain an initiative, how do you fund it over time beyond the usual players, things like that. What about examples that are not in the water sector? And I know that I'd like to hear from everybody on this one in terms of, all right, so, you know, we're talking about wicked problems, we're talking about catalytic communities at a pretty high level, adding some granularity to it, but like, what is it still? And give us some examples of what catalytic communities look like that may be in plain sight, if you will. Tom, could you start? And then Anna, if you could weigh in on that.
So I'll actually mention three. I'll use one historical example that goes way back. Just think for a moment to ancient Greece, Socrates engaging people in conversation and the learning that began to occur in a context like that, and what that then allowed in terms of people beginning to think and engage and connect, and how powerful that became. And I'll take it forward into the present, not quite the present. In the US, the film that came out recently captured people's attention was Oppenheimer. Mm-hmm. The Manhattan Project could be described as both a horrible kind of thing that occurs, and catalytic community can produce extraordinary and wonderful things and powerful and horrible things. So like AI, which may be applied in powerful and wondrous ways and in frightening ways. It's possible to see the Manhattan Project as illustrative of how a thing can move at such great speed and command extraordinary resources and engage people who ordinarily wouldn't be speaking with one another. So that happened. And then last, a little nicer than the Manhattan Project, Wikipedia. Just think about what had to come together at the beginning in terms of financial resources, shared vision, and then a set of rules that would allow something to come together in a way that would allow us to trust and leverage this commons, right? This shared set of information that we all have come to rely on to a pretty extraordinary degree. Those are just some examples of this. And by the way, I loved what I heard from Anna, Carolina, Austin, and I can imagine the conversations that we're talking about now fostering the notion of catalytic community at the speed of trust in the way that we've been discussing. I'm excited about it.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that in terms of things that are not in the world of water to make this real, come to life? Anna?
Sure. Yeah, sorry. I was struggling to come off mute. Happy to. And not to plug something I researched and wrote about years ago when I was at Deloitte, but there's a paper we put out called Participate, the Power of Involving Business in Social Impact Networks, which covers dozens of case studies where there's happening beyond the world of water. But one of the things that might be material or relevant or interesting for the sake of this conversation is because we were looking at the motivation that companies have, businesses have to join what we call social impact networks. And I should just preface that I come from the world of doing impact strategy primarily in the philanthropic social sector for foundations and nonprofits. So we were looking at the question, how do we as the social sector, the philanthropic sector, more intentionally and successfully engage businesses in networks that are designed to deliver social impact. And I think the kind of insight at the heart of this, these networks that involve businesses and the social sector is a value exchange that gives both business leaders and social change leaders a reason to make participation a strategic priority. But we found that these networks tend to break down in 5 times potential business value that they can drive. One is in creating new market opportunities. So we see a lot of activity around networks where there's an opportunity for new market opportunity. Networks that are about shaping industry standards that we just can't have the private sector shaping those standards for themselves. These networks play a huge role in attracting top talent to businesses to enhance the company's brand value and to build resilient supply chains. So I think in all of those kind of typologies of networks, we see so many examples, and that research paper that I referenced catalogs a lot of them. One that I'm actively involved in now is, as I was mentioning, it's called the New Capitalism Project, and how it may be slightly different from world water is that it's not geographically based. We're based in the U.S. It's a regional thing. It's shifting our capital markets. That's not a tangible, local geographically based entity to focus on. But it applies the same thinking around aligned action, which is how do we bring a diverse set of stakeholders from labor, from shareholder activism, from the business community, from impact investing, from policy, from grassroots. How do we kind of the edict, if you want to change the system, get the system in the room, which means get all the different perspectives and players in the room, and how do we build that cohesive story of change over time? We too, Carolina, launched the New Capitalism Project 2 months before COVID shut the whole world down. We had leaders showing up, leaders of large NGOs and nonprofits in the US showing up every other week This was a mandate for participation for 90-minute Zoom calls to do that collective strategy process over time. And so that's just a little glimpse into, maybe we can get into, Will, the process. Like, this stuff's hard. It requires a really different stance to change than I think we're typically used to in our organizational context.
Yeah, I agree with that. Just going back to, there's no shortage of pledges, but in terms of actually getting stuff done and, understanding what it takes, it's, again, more than writing a check. It's showing up, it's being accountable, and it's embracing speed, not just for the sake of it, but to really scale and impact. Richard, how are we on time? Do we have a few minutes for Anna to dive into the exercise, or should we go right to Q&A?
Let's go audience Q&A and then we can work with exercise.
Okay, all right, audience Q&A. The live audience? Oh, you made me so happy. I can't tell you the pressure.
Do it first.
I don't care. How about this gentleman, only because your hand is the highest in the room. And by the way, can you please just, who are you and what organization you want to be associated with or not?
Does this work? Okay.
Yes.
I'm Nick Kosar. I'm a reporter for Abangan and also an analyst for BBC and other organizations.
Wow.
Okay. My question is, I have a problem. I'm not sure is it a wicked problem or not. We have a country that the government is destroying its water resources, and the people have Stockholm syndrome and have done nothing against the government. It's not just because of this conference in Stockholm, but they have the syndrome. And in the near future, we think that millions of people of that country will have no other options but to leave as migrants, something like happened in Syria and other countries. The country I'm talking about is the Islamic Republic of Iran, or Iran. How could we solve a problem when the activists who want to help the people inside the country are out of the country and the people have no power because of the top-down relationship in decision-making and so forth? Thank you.
That's an amazing question, by the way. I'm glad I picked you first. And nothing against everybody else, but who wants to? I'm happy to say something.
I have a question of the questioner. So, who do you think needs to come to the table to have the conversation and that might work to build catalytic community at the speed of trust in that context?
Tom, you sound like a consultant.
This is the Ahmadinejad technique. He answered questions by asking questions, but we're out of that era, so I don't know. But because the government doesn't care and it has destroyed lakes, aquifers, rivers.
Just to jump in on this, no, look, I don't want to minimize the challenge that the country faces, but I would throw out that it has to be entrepreneurs, other actors that really foster change in the public sector. Now, in the U.S., I think the public sector is the problem with respect to water. There's no shortage of regulations, but we have no strategy at the federal level. So how do other actors become that catalyst for change? And in the U.S., there's a lot more room because you actually have investors, you have an entrepreneurial base there, you have multinationals that can intervene in NGOs. So I don't know, it's a longer conversation, clearly. I would just pose that looking at other stakeholder groups that maybe have some latitude to influence other stakeholders to ultimately change the public sector, get them to care. And maybe when it starts to impact economic development, economic growth, money seems to motivate everybody. So, if you can really draw a line to why this water problem is impacting the country's ability to grow economically, might be the way. I don't know. But why don't we
Will,
move
can
on?
I take
Yes.
a stab?
Of course.
Responding?
Yes.
Can you all? Oh, okay. And I can't see the gentleman who asked that question, that it's not an insignificant challenge that you just put into this conversation. And one of the maybe small pieces of advice I could offer on that front is, in the beginning of any aligned action effort, we see a market phase of discovery or knowing. And by that I mean there is a landscape of actors in your context that you just shared who cares about those issues. They are probably fragmented, isolated in silos, and not too connected. And so I think one of the questions is to how do you get a better understanding of the landscape of actors who share this concern? Who is doing what, where? How are organizations connected? How are they not connected? Where is the opportunity to way more intentionally stitch these actors together in a collective process of trying to address this situation, right? And that takes effort, that will require leadership of one or many organizations saying we're going to do this. And how do you just mobilize and galvanize these distributed actors in way more intentional ways so you can achieve that greater alignment and coordination and connection that's required. And that takes work up front. So who can own that effort? Is one way we can think about it. Currently, I can vaguely see you may have some thoughts to share.
I would also add, start small. Sometimes when wicked problems are so daunting and at a national, global level, that creates even more inertia that at the end is the biggest challenge, right? And catalytic communities, what they do is the bias for action, right? They make us move and deliver results. So I think when you're facing such a big problem, a wicked problem, perhaps start small. And the good thing with water is that it touches everyone, right? Water is the basis of life. And when you're at a watershed, everyone that is located at the watershed uses that water and has a relationship with that water. So perhaps if you start there, if you start engaging all the stakeholders, trying to find bottom-up solutions, working in governance, then that can be enhanced. It can inspire other groups forming elsewhere. So I think, and again, I would just say the perfect is the enemy of the good. So we have little time to act to solve this wicked problem. Sometimes it's better just to start where we can at a smaller scale to grow.
I would encourage you to reach out to the panelists for follow-up. Again, it's not going to get answered now, but this woman right here.
Thank you. My name is Louise. I run a startup in the world of hydromet, and we operate in Malawi and Mozambique. And like many startups, we are working very hard to make sure that the problem, product, user has a smooth and lovely fit. But when it comes to the problem, user, product, and market fit, we often face the barriers that so many startups face in trying to deliver innovations into the world of water, and especially the world of public services water. So listening to you guys, I'm wondering, when you think of collective action, where, how does the barriers of markets that are so inherent and really blocking, new innovations coming through, how are they brought into this process of and platforms of collaborating to ensure, look, maybe reduce those market risks, for example?
You want to go?
I can speak to that. When we're talking about innovation and the startup world, I think one of the main things we should allow ourselves to fail, right? To fail and to continue. And sometimes that is hard, like in large corporations, to allow ourselves to fail. That's why I really love the example of the 100 Plus Accelerator, because we created the enabling conditions for startups to fail with us or succeed with us, but do it together, right? So when you're out with an innovation and it still doesn't have the perfect match, the perfect fit, I think it's important that you foster a partnership that helps you throughout that journey. And that's exactly what we do. If you are selected for the 100 Plus Accelerator, if you're in Malawi, if you're in Bogota, if you're in Los Angeles, wherever you are, we're going to assign a local team that is going to plan everything hand in hand with you. And it's going to establish KPIs with you, timeline with you, budget with you, and help you navigate throughout the process. And you wouldn't imagine the learning curve. And going back to the reasons to partner, the reasons to collaborate, when a startup goes through this process with a company like AB InBev, for example, and then works with Coca-Cola, well, the learning curve is done. The startup has already gained so much knowledge by working with a company, and that's the way that we've done it. Also, I think we need to be flexible and create other enabling conditions for startups to thrive. Something that we have done, which is pretty easy to do for a company, but changes the play for the startup is, for example, preferred payment terms. We allow down payments, we allow preferred payment terms because we know that startups suffer with cash flow, they don't have all the capital to invest on the pilot immediately. So those are like the little things that we have built in to make sure that we are setting the startup up for success. Otherwise, the chances of failing are very, very high.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that, Tom?
Maybe two other things. One, from an entrepreneurial perspective, to the extent that entrepreneurs are standing on or working from something I'll call the adjacent possible, meaning it's not just the objective that's intended, it's also something that's proximate, that constitutes leverage to be able to do something meaningful in that market that maybe didn't exist 5 years ago, maybe not even a year ago. You can look at, for example, the most successful of the tech companies that have been created in the history of the world and recognize a peculiar facet of all of them, and that's that none of those founders could have built those businesses 5 years before they did. So what thing has happened that might constitute that source of leverage for an entrepreneur in context? That's a really significant thing to think about. And then maybe the market as it's been described is not the market. So it's often the case that we've been wrong about how we've drawn our boundary around what that market is and what the best market to serve is, and we have to rethink it. So it isn't always clear. And I'd say exactly what Carolina did, that sometimes it turns out this isn't the solution for that market, and we have to move on. We have to say that failed, what's the next thing? So
I encourage you to follow up also. All right.
Yeah, you all had both referred to Ostrom's work. So I was thinking that, in a book on crafting institutions, she had developed these 8 principles of crafting a collective institutions around the self-governance principles, right? So for the wicked problems, beyond the definition of what constitutes a catalytic community, are there principles which have been evolved, which are sort of common across? So that was one question. And the second part was that the examples I'm hearing of the catalytic community are people who are different, but they are not adversarial. But when you work on the ground, I'm working in places where there is an industry which is polluting the groundwater, and there is a community which has to drink the groundwater. And that the state which is sort of colluding, how do you then bring them all together in sort of a common goal, and then they work out some common solutions? So how do you deal with adversarial or exploitative partners in a common way ahead?
So I want to jump in on your last point and then turn it over to the rest of the panel. But my view is that there are some stakeholders you won't bring along, and they will be adverse, and I would argue that the status quo is adverse, the installed base, period. So that's your competition, that is your adversary, and how do you, depending on what you're doing, become an irritant and scale your network to compel them to change?
Change the power equation.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, that's my personal view, which is why I believe some of these challenges will be solved by the startups, no matter how daunting it is. Startups working with multinationals or NGOs, academic institutions. So how do you become that irritant for change? And maybe that's heresy, but I don't know. What does the rest of the group think?
I don't know if this is on point, but there's a point of alignment between the startups and the established organizations. There's a way larger organizations can leverage startups to do what it is they wouldn't be able to do themselves. I think of larger corporate entities as sometimes having what we call corporate antibodies that work to reject the innovation that otherwise would come forward. This happens a lot. So what do? Maybe as a larger corporate entity, as you're looking at the challenge to be faced, you leverage a startup that can actually do the thing that you won't be able to do internally. And you reap the reward if that's successful, but you also don't have to be as accountable for it if it fails. It's outside the four walls of your larger corporation. That lets you experiment. It lets you move at greater speed. It lets you do things you wouldn't ordinarily be able to do. And that's one way to begin to leverage a set of perspectives that lives in that larger organization and couple it with extraordinary speed, focus, defined market disruption potentially.
One thing I would add, I'm convinced that startups just need to show up. If you think about what's happened in the world of ride sharing, Uber and Lyft, and it's different because they're not dealing with water, but they basically showed up and they changed public policy because consumers wanted it. And when I think about the world of water, I think about decentralized, extreme decentralized water systems. So gray water reuse in your home, real-time water quality testing in your home, that'll change public policy, maybe in some ways, the way renewables changed, the power profile by going directly to users and consumers. So food for thought there. Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I'll jump in on what Tom was mentioning. I think as an example of a large company that Xylem is, many of our products have been around for over 100 years. That kind of internal innovation has been something we've wrestled with as an organization. Perfect example of that. And have found success by creating my colleagues these Xylem Innovation Labs that partners from university venture capital. We have an accelerator program, all focused in the water sector, to say we have finally come to recognize that we will not build solutions alone. It won't happen, but it's too slow, it's too expensive, it'll just take way too long. But if we create avenues for partnering with other entities that can, or startups that can create smooth interactions with them to allow for them access to Xylem and vice versa, that really helps to lubricate the speed to which we're able to get innovation forward. And I want to mention, I think the gentleman's question, and I apologize if it was a little bit tough to hear, but there is an element of working with competitors and peers to say we all win when we come together and invest in these kind of systems. And then we'll duke it out, on the competitive front, but the ways we create avenues for speeding innovations in the industry is good for all of us. And that is worth us coming together and having a conversation on to make that go forward.
Yeah, and to add on, Austin, I think what you mentioned is what happens when there are adversaries, or in the case of innovation and startups, naysayers. That happens all the time. We have this amazing innovation, and people sometimes like to do the things that they've been doing for the last decade and keep on doing them. And it's hard to bring in a new set of mindset, right? So I think what's really important is to actually be able to socialize and communicate what's the real win-win. And at the end, the person that adopts the technology really needs to want this technology. We faced that as a challenge in the 100 Plus Accelerator, when these solutions came as a really amazing idea from a top-down approach from the global team into the zones or to the business unit. And sometimes the business unit would say, no, but this is not what I need. This is not aligned with my local context and reality. So the most successful initiatives are the ones that the local team actually really wants. And the way that you manage to create that win-win situation is the key to success. So sometimes naysayers aren't really adversaries. They just need to change the perspective. And I will add one thing, and it's the role of active listening. Because in the world that we are today, we don't listen to each other. We just want like results. We are heading at a very fast speed that we forget to actually listen what our colleagues really need, what are the problems that they're struggling with. And when it comes to a basin and the example that you just gave, that's even more important, right? Because it could be a case where you're looking at different stakeholders that are not, in essence, adversaries. They all really need, in the long run, to have a healthy ecosystem, to have clean water. So how do you create that level space where they can all see the win-win situation and understand why do they care? Because if you don't care for a solution, if you don't own it, you're never going to move, right?
So we have time for one or two more questions.
Thanks. I'm Abhishek from Unilever, actually, so working quite close with the 100 Plus Accelerator program as well, so Karolina will talk about that later. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the governance side of things, because when I hear about the qualities that make for a great catalytic community, bias for action, trust, let's just get things done, these are typically not groups of people that are also very happy to put rules and steering committees and lots of active governance in place, because that slows us down. And so I sort of received the 100 Plus Accelerator as a finished product, so it seems to be a very well-acting community with great governance and great everything, but it must have been really messy to get to that point. So for 100 Plus specifically, or generally for these, for catalytic communities, I'm curious to hear what were the learnings about, and by the way, this is what governance we need, so despite us wanting to be very action-oriented and very, let's do whatever needs to be done, we still need to have structure in place. What do those conversations look like? Any learnings for us trying to replicate that in other ways?
I will reiterate on the first learning, which I would recommend this as a recipe for anyone who is building this type of partnerships. And it was the workshop that we did where we all sat together and defined and co-created the principles, because it's very important that these principles are kept even if I'm not here, or Macy, who founded the program, is not there, or Kieran, from Unilever, or Alexandra, who was the focal point from Unilever and now she left to another role. Those principles should stay for the long run. And for example, the fact that we're founder friendly, we put the founder at the center, that we are here for collective action. And we did that and got everyone inspired and moved in an emotional level, which is important, right? And then, once we had that brief of the things that we wanted, then we brought in the lawyers, we gave them the brief, and please help us set up the legal structure for this partnership, because of course we need guardrails. And the second thing I would say is that sometimes we want to have so many rules because we're always scared of the worst case scenario. And they have also taught us to always think of the worst case scenario. And it happened to us in the accelerator. For example, in the first year of the partnership, everyone was super scared of what would happen if all the 4 companies wanted the same startup to pilot with, who would have the right to pilot, what would happen in that situation. That was one of the things that was a concern at the beginning. Another one was, what if a partner is actually not willing to cooperate? Because the basis of the accelerator is that we're going to share results, right? We're going to learn from each other to help the startups also scale at a faster pace. And Unilever and Colgate are competitors. Coca-Cola and AB InBev are also competitors in some markets. So we sat down and created this set of governance. Okay, in scenario A, this is what's going to happen. Scenario B, and those like bad case scenarios have never happened, right? And I think that right now, we have that Word document with the A, B, C, and D. But the good thing is that when you trust each other and when you create like this enabling environment, it's very rare that happens. It's good to have it just to make everyone feel safe. But when you build trust and you're going towards a common goal that stays even if people leave, I think it's very hard to go to that bad case scenarios.
Great. Thanks for the question. One more?
Yeah, one more.
Hi. So it's kind of a follow-up to the gentleman's question from earlier, which is how do you ensure that all actors within your catalytic community are engaging in good faith and do have a sort of bias for action? I think it's not difficult to imagine a situation in public health or environmental issues where people might engage to frustrate action. And then a kind of follow-up to that, does there come a point at which, as you're trying to stitch together all these perhaps diametrically opposed narratives and priorities, that you accept that there isn't time, particularly with environmental issues, for a catalytic community approach, and perhaps you need a more top-down approach?
Who wants to go for that? Austin, Anna, Tom?
I need the question restated. I think I didn't hear it as clearly as I needed to respond effectively, so I'm sorry.
Well, let me try, but I think I also have some information on your question.
Thanks, Austin.
Yeah. I think, it's if I understood the question, how do you deal with potential, I didn't understand the bad actors, but maybe kind of drags on the collective group.
Perhaps stakeholders who don't want to see action.
Carolina brought up a really good point earlier of building foundations of trust, and I think transparency in our intentions, both as organizations trying to create communities, but also joining communities and raising concerns and questions early is up to us, and that opens a conversation. There will undoubtedly be forces against different movements, something probably Tom and Anna can speak to much better than I can, that we'll have to deal with as we go. But the more partners in arms that we build through trust, that makes that addressing those a lot easier. And so I think, open transparency, admitting what you don't know, admitting your concerns up front allows for other organizations to do the same. In the example of what we did in Waterway, we absolutely had partners that came in with questions, ourselves internally questions, and then I think raising those early with each other up front made for a smoother conversation with partners that maybe were hesitant at first, but realized that intentions behind those were positive and were to work together. I'm not sure if I totally captured the gentleman's question, but hopefully I did.
Yeah, well, I think you did, but again, I encourage you to reach out to the group.
Maybe I could just take a step too and tie a few threads together that I've heard raised in the conversation. So I think I think it was Carolina who said, one antidote to the gentleman's question is about starting small. And often it's the question of like, how big do we make these catalytic communities? Where do we start? If we want to develop the trust needed to sustain the long-term effort, I think starting small, and that doesn't mean starting with a kind of homogeneous group of people, but if there is diversity of opinion, if there are people who are participating to derail this collective effort, I would say those are not the people you want. And in any system, industry, sector, wicked problem, there will always be those people and organizations that exist to maintain status quo, and they will fight disruption to their prevalence or privilege or power at every step of the way. And we can see this in any sector, in any industry, in any issue area. And so being really sober-minded about what the stance to change is among different actors is really important. That said, in the world I've been living in around reimagining capitalism, using that diversity of opinion is really, really important. We have people in our network who fundamentally believe in the power of capitalism and business to improve the world. And we have people in our group who fundamentally do not believe in the power of capitalism and good business to solve and address the problems we face in the world. Those are diametrically opposed, you could say irreconcilable views. And we could say, okay, well, you guys have to go into your separate camps and figure this out. But we chose to hold that diversity of perspective and often pretty conflicting views of the problem and hence the solution in that creative tension over time. And where it was just a difference of opinion, not a desire to derail the process. And doing that is, it's more art than science. It depends on the person or the group that is holding the whole. We haven't talked about that, but that kind of network coordinator, ecosystem integrator, whatever term Carolina, you played that role, or Austin, you played that role in the efforts you brought into this conversation. But that facilitative capacity is actually highly important and often undervalued in these kinds of efforts. Yeah.
I love that you got lit up on the topic. And I hate to cut you short, but
No worries.
we've got a few minutes. The most important person in pulling this off is Richard Forthing-Nickel. And he has a few closing thoughts based on what he heard. And I don't exaggerate when I said Richard made it happen.
He doesn't.
Thank you.
Go for it.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you especially to Will, our speakers, Jenny, Stefan, everyone who helped pull this together. I think this is the first of 3 sessions in our governance seminar series for World Water Week. It was a great way to kick it off. Amazing discussion. We have about 2 minutes for these comments. I'm going to abbreviate them. The thank yous are the most important part. The plug for the session tomorrow and the next day are also very important. I had 3 things I wanted to say, but one came up in particular. So I think I want to focus on that, which is the role of the public sector. And so this was a tremendous session because we really brought in private sector perspectives. We talked about entrepreneurship. We talked about things that I think in the water solution space we're only just starting to talk about and that we need to pay more attention to. And Will, in one of your papers, I loved your very succinct definition of catalytic community as groups of diverse stakeholders that have a bias for action. And when I read that, because I'm a public policy guy, I thought, who doesn't have a bias for action is governments, often. They're risk averse, they're bound by bureaucracy, they're accountable to, democracy, to different interests. And I think it can be tempting because of that to exclude them from these types of collaborations, from catalytic communities. And I think it's extremely important to not do that. Governments are obviously tremendous resource banks in terms of funding. They have democratic legitimacy. They also have unparalleled ability to gather data, to act as a central coordinating mechanism. So I think, for me, the big challenge for these types of collaborations for catalytic communities is to say, what is the role, seriously, what is the role of public policy? What is the role of governments? And to be very clear about that and kind of lean into that conversation. And I think a couple things. One is that, as I mentioned, governments and public policy can play a really important role in terms of enabling policy, in terms of financial mechanisms like social environmental impact bonds. And then two, there's a lot that catalytic communities in turn can do to lean into that policy discussion. I know there's corporates out there that are doing that, and they're saying it's not just about our operations, it's not even just about our impact in the watershed, but it's about influencing policy discussions. So I think that synergy in those conversations really need to happen. I think I have time for one more thing. Sure, yeah. The other really important point, and we did touch on a lot, is the idea of scaling, and particularly deep scaling. So when we talk about an innovation, a water innovation, not just widespread adoption of an innovation, which of course is a huge part of scaling, but also how do we shift mindsets, how do we shift values, how do we shift practices to really achieve systematic change. And so I think catalytic communities are really key for that and the whole idea of this type of collaboration, and I want to push that further as well. So that's it. We're done. I was told we had a hard stop. We're already a minute past it, but thank you so much to Will, to Water Foundry Ventures, all of the co-conveners, and thank you all for attending the session.